So here we are, ready to talk about Freud and psychoanalysis. And I think I said to you guys, this is a chapter I imagine many of you thought we might get to sooner than our halfway point. But here we are, and this is the first of the traditional theories that we'll talk about. And following this, we'll talk about a whole bunch of theorists that essentially adapted Freud's theories. But here we're going to talk about the traditional theory. So I want to start with this quote that I always want to start with when I talk about Freud. It is not the function of the pioneer to have the last word, but to say the first word. And I think this is an important thing to take a moment and think about, because it's really easy to dismiss Freud. It's really easy to laugh at Freud and to see his ideas as silly or antiquated. But the reality is that many of the things that Freud proposed we just have folded into our cultural understanding of human beings without really ever maybe even thinking about giving credit to Freud for them. And then we kind of focus on those parts of his theory that do feel old-fashioned or outdated to us. But it's important to remember they are outdated, that some of them are, but that the fundamentals of his theory, in many ways, we just kind of take as truth without really thinking about the fact that they're his. So I'd like you to keep that in mind, kind of in the back, so maybe in the back of the forefront of your mind as we go through this. So it's important, kind of in that context, it's important to remember that as any theory, right, this is true of any theory, Freud's theory is influenced by the nature of his scientific education, and that would be based in the time period in which he lived. And also kind of the general cultural ideas of his time. And it's important to remember that Freud lived during the Victorian era. And so this is the late 1800s, the early 1900s. The end of Freud's career comes at the very beginning of the 20th century, 1905 or so is when he is at the peak of his respect and career. And the Victorian era is a very particular era, and maybe you remember this from history classes, but in Victorian Europe, women held no power. Very literally, they couldn't vote. They couldn't own property. Once they married, their property either belonged to their father, or once they married, any property they owned belonged to their husband, which means if their husband left them, the husband took the property with them. They also could not have legal rights to their children. So again, in the case of divorce, the husband had legal rights to the children and not the mother. And so, in terms of some of the gendered things we see in Freud's theory, it's important to remember it was a very gendered society with a very big power differential between men and women. But his scientific education also, it's a time when we have a sudden and increased understanding of biology. Physics is having a lot of attention given to it, and so it is not surprising that Freud focuses on biological drives, which would have been the biological science of his time, but also that he talks a lot about energy systems, which reflects his understanding of physics at the time. And so these are some of the things that maybe make less sense with more modern understanding of science and more advancements in science, and also with changes in our culture. Some of what he talks about makes a little bit less sense. But again, a lot of it is really very basic to what is now our understanding of human beings. So here we have a list of things that Freud's initial ideas and basic ideas have led to, or assumptions we make that Freud first gave us, but that we just see these as truths and don't worry about who to credit them to. And the beginning, we're going to come back again and again to the idea that's very important to Freud, which is that if you want to understand personality development, you need to imagine the individual, and in most cases for Freud, the individual child, but the individual coming up against the social world. And that's true of personality development, and then becomes true for understanding behavior as we move through adult life. And what we mean by this is that the needs and desires of the individual often are not the same as the needs and desires of the people around them or the culture more generally. So that what the child is having to figure out, what the child is having to learn from a very early age is how to make choices about when they push forward with what they want and when they have to accommodate cultural norms, cultural demands, social demands. And that is something that, as we go through the psychosexual stages later, I really want you to make sure you focus on, because that is what the psychosexual stages are about. And they're often morphed in some way or twisted in some way to be about other things, but that really is what they're about. And the best example of that is the child who just wants to be held and nurtured all of the time, and a mother or father who have to do some other things some of the time, and the child has to learn to delay gratification. And that is a very basic thing for small children to have to learn, right? So that's a basic idea that Freud gives us, is that we come up against the social world. And maybe you could even pause here and think about all of the ways in your day-to-day life that you have to delay gratification or deny yourself something that you want because it's not socially acceptable, or because it would deprive or harm other people around you. So we'll come back to that idea. Freud gives us the idea of levels of consciousness. Even in your Psych 111 class, when you talked about the consciousness chapter and talked about dual processing and selective attention, you kind of approach that with just the assumption that that was true. And we have scientific evidence to back that up now in brain imaging. But Freud's the first one to introduce that idea in any way, and it is the core of his theory. The idea that we have levels of consciousness. We have the conscious mind, which is what you and I are using in this moment as we look at this material, and then we have the preconscious mind, which is our attention could go there at any moment. We just aren't using it right now, and the unconscious, which is more definitively put out of our attention. It doesn't mean things there can't ever come into consciousness, but it's not just momentary. They're there, and that is a really important part. We'll talk about the unconscious in various ways, but at this point we can just talk about how important the unconscious was for Freud in determining behavior and personality, that much of what we struggle with, much of what shapes us, are not things that are conscious. But Freud also talked about, and it's one of my favorite quotes, not just for Freud, in general, he described the unconscious as a seething cauldron of unacceptable wishes, impulses, and desires. And I want you to imagine that for a second, because when we say the word seething cauldron, I think of kind of witches, right? Big black pot with maybe icky stuff boiling over, and what's in that cauldron for Freud, right? The cauldron is the unconscious, and what's in that cauldron are unacceptable wishes, impulses, and desires. And so it's all the stuff that we do better not to know about ourselves, all the things we want, right? Our wishes, all the things we want to do, our impulses, right? All the things we want to possess, our desires. And knowing those things would just make it hard to get through day-to-day life. And so we push them into our unconscious. But they sit there under the surface, right? Freud's theory is often symbolized with an iceberg, the idea that our conscious mind is the tip of the iceberg, but our unconscious is this giant collection of stuff under the surface. And that is the unconscious mind, and it makes up the bulk of what motivates our behavior. He also emphasized the importance of life history in determining behavior, and again, this feels obvious to us now. It colored every conversation we've had to this point about personality, but even before you took a personality class, as you move through life, it makes perfect sense to you that early childhood experiences will shape who you are, that past experiences and romantic relationships will determine what you're like in future relationships. But again, this was not an idea before Freud gave it to us. And I really I can't emphasize enough how often I feel bad for Freud for that his most basic and most important ideas we just accept as truth, and then we kind of we nickel and dime him or pick him to death about the other details of his theory that we don't find as relevant. But the idea here is that life history is important in determining behavior. Often Freud's theory is referred to as a deterministic theory. You can see this word determined has shown up in terms of unconscious, in terms of life history. The idea is that who you are today has already been determined, and that you actually have relatively little ability to change who you are. Not no ability, but relatively little compared to what's already been set. And that Freud kind of thinks that our past has kind of set who we are in stone a bit, and that the only change that can occur is by taking the jackhammer of psychoanalysis, right? Therapy that is 5 days a week for years and years, but taking that jackhammer and rearranging the stone. That was Freud's idea about that. But the idea that our life history is important, I think it feels pretty basic to most of us. And then finally, we have the effects of repression and other defense mechanisms. Repression is our most primitive defense mechanism, and it is exactly what it sounds like, which is that we push aside or repress information and push it into our unconscious. It takes a lot of energy to do that, and we will talk in a little bit about the idea of a closed energy system. But it takes a lot of our energy to do that. But the idea that we have defense mechanisms, again, we use that word all of the time, that phrase. But this is Freud's phrase, and he is the one that introduces us to the idea that sometimes we behave in ways or think in ways or act in ways that are meant to sidestep issues or to protect us from having to look at issues. So we're going to stop this video here and pick up in the next video.